Please pray with me. God, may the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you and you only, God, are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So not only is God not mentioned in the book of Esther, nobody in the book seems bothered at all by that fact. And some today, it seems, get really bent out of shape if God is not mentioned at every possible moment. Before we get into today's theme from Esther, I suppose we should start with a brief retelling of the story, not quite as brief as or neat and tidy as the 20-word summary that you just got in the video. But the story is set in Persia. King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, depending on the source, is king, and it likely happened sometime around the year 483 before Christ, because Xerxes came to the throne in 486, and chapter 1 tells us that this begins at the celebration of his having served as king for 3 years. So the Jews had been taken off into exile in Persia quite a while before this. As a people, they clearly feel out of place, but they've made the best of it. There's no sign, no indication in the book that they waste any time pining for a return to the glory days or trying to go back to their promised land. In fact, this book, the Book of Esther, has one purpose only, and that's to explain the Jewish holiday of Purim. Xerxes, as I've said, is king. Vashti in chapter 1 is king, but she displeases King Xerxes, so she's banished, and a new queen is sought. Esther, being a young woman who's a Jew, and she has been raised by her cousin Mordecai, she gets swept up in this 4th century before Christ version of The Bachelor, except there's no real dating, and it all happens in one episode. So Mordecai, her uncle, who's raised her, again like a daughter, coaches her along the way, including telling her to keep her Jewishness quiet and to herself. So about the same time, Mordecai also overhears a couple of guards at the king's gate plotting to kill the king and reports them to Queen Esther. Queen Esther, in turn, tells the king and makes a point to say that this information comes from Mordecai. The ensuing investigation finds the two guys guilty and has them put to death. So Mordecai becomes exalted in the eyes of the king, but at the same time, he also ticks off Haman, who has just become the king's right-hand man, by refusing to bow to him, by refusing to bow to Haman, that is. We don't know if Mordecai would have refused to bow to the king. That's more a Book of Daniel kind of thing, and we may approach that another time. But the king himself had ordered, at Haman's request, that everybody should bow to Haman. But Mordecai wouldn't do it. So Haman is, I think, royally offended, and he's convinces the king to issue a proclamation for capital punishment, not only for Mordecai, but for all of Mordecai's people. And Mordecai, as I may have mentioned, is Jewish. So apparently, Haman had gotten a little bit angry at Mordecai. So Haman describes Mordecai's people to the king this way. He says, "A certain group of people exist in pockets among all the other people of all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different than those of everyone else, and they refuse to obey the king's laws," which does sound a little bit like Daniel, but again, that's another story. But there's no good reason for the king, he continues, to put up with these people any longer. So the king ordered not only for all of these people to be killed, but for all of their property to be confiscated. Mordecai learned of this threat to him, to Queen Esther, and to all of their people, and he was obviously incredibly sad. You can possibly imagine this, that all the Jews were sad that the king had issued this edict that sometime in the future they would all be slaughtered. Esther, chapter 4, verse 5 tells us, was so upset that her whole body showed how upset she was. So Mordecai and Esther developed this plan to save all of the Jewish people. She earns the right to be heard by the king. Again, I'm really summarizing this because you should read this. It's only 10 chapters, and one of them was read for you this morning. So she wins the right to be heard by the king, and in front of Haman tells the king that Haman's plot And the proclamation that Haman had the king sign would kill not just all the Jews, but that would include Esther. So, again, long story short, Haman ends up being impaled on a 75-foot spike that Haman had intended for Mordecai. And the king issues another royal decree saying that all the Jews are not to be killed after all. Hence the Jewish holiday of Purim. Now, there's a whole lot more to this story. There's opulence, there's political intrigue. Again, you'll just have to read it. Or if you've been following our GPS, our Grow Pray study guide in the bulletin, then you will have finished Esther today. So you've read all of this and you know the longer version of it. But did I mention God's role in the story? No, I did not. That's because God isn't mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. It doesn't even appear. There's not even stories of the great things God has done for God's people. Not a whisper. There is no God to speak of in the book of Esther. Now, in the Greek retelling of Esther that's included in the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation and compilation of the Hebrew Bible, this is the retelling of the story includes some references to God, but in the one that made the cut, that's in the Hebrew Bible, that's in our Old Testament, there's no reference to God at all. God is not mentioned. So is this significant? And if it is significant, how is it significant? I don't know about the grand scale, but I believe that it might have quite a bit to say for us today, because whether we like it or not, we live in a cultural setting that bears some resemblance to that in the book of Esther. Esther opens, as I think I mentioned, with the king throwing a party to celebrate that he's been king for 3 years. What I didn't mention is this party that he threw lasted for 6 months. The point was, again, this is in chapter 1, he showed off the awesome riches of his kingdom and the beautiful treasures as mirrors of how great he was. It could have happened in 2015. Opulent, extravagant spending, long, lavish celebrations. However, even though he was fabulously wealthy, apparently, the story to me reads like the king is just a dupe, because Haman comes to and asks him to sign this proclamation, effectively wiping out a race of people, and the king signs it. Later in the story, Esther comes in probably dressed pretty nicely, and the king's response is, "Ask me for anything you want, up to half my kingdom, and it's yours." It seems to indicate that these were times that the people acted without considering their consequences or the implications of their actions, and sometimes at the direction and mere suggestion of others. And if that doesn't remind you of today, pick up the newspaper. So Haman, again, newly promoted to being the king's right-hand man, sees one man refuse to bow to him. So what does he do? He gets the king to sign a death sentence on this man's entire people. Can you say overreaction? It was like Haman was looking to be offended. Today, if you're looking to be offended at the right time and place, you get your own reality TV show or a news show, or you might even parlay it into a run for office. I don't know, but in the midst of all this, we learn that Mordecai and Esther sought to be faithful. Haman sought his own gain and glory at the expense of whoever might get in his way, and Mordecai and Esther sought to be faithful. So which are we more like? Now you might be thinking, if I say that Mordecai and Esther sought to be faithful, that I must mean that they sought to be faithful to God, and maybe I do, and maybe Esther does, but it doesn't say that. Maybe it's because mentioning God is not always helpful. There's no doubt throughout the book of Esther that the Jews are faithful to each other. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine God's people all being faithful to each other? I mean, instead, today, we're more likely tearing each other apart, and sometimes doing so in God's name. Progressives are saying the evangelicals don't even read the part of the Bible that includes Jesus, and evangelicals are saying the progressives aren't even actually Christians anymore. We're coming to the Christmas season. As we approach Christmas, we may be tempted to develop a very thin skin and look to be offended by those who don't celebrate the way we do. I mean, if someone says happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, do we think a glare or a tirade will draw them to Christ? Do we forget that a soft answer turns away wrath, but an offensive word stirs up anger? And however offensive the other's word might be, we're only responsible for our own words. Let's face it, we live in a culture that does not belong to us. Christians, we have always lived in a culture that does not belong to us. We've tried to believe otherwise. We've tried. The challenge since 380, the year 380 AD, the challenge has been for Christians. By the way, 380 was the year that Christianity was declared the official religion of the Roman Empire. And ever since, we've been fighting to find this way to bring the light of Christ into this culture, whatever culture we find ourselves in. And we too often think that we should act in one of two ways. Either we should force others to act Christian, or we retreat from culture, whatever culture we find ourselves in, and throw up our hands as though there's no hope for them, the great unwashed masses. But Esther teaches us another option. As queen, she seeks to influence the king. She doesn't lead with her own ethnic identity, and she never tells him stories of God's people's past, threatening him with the God who had parted the Red Sea for Jews, but then let it collapse on Pharaoh's army. Never threatened him with the God who had, with David, slayed Goliath, or the God who delivered Elijah victory in the face of 450 prophets of Baal. Esther doesn't mention any of those things. Instead, she played by the rules of the game in Persia as much as possible while remaining faithful to who she was and to her people. Kind of reminds me of that St. Francis commission to all of us to preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, to use words. It reminds me of Jesus telling his followers to be as wise as serpents, but as harmless as doves. And Esther did this without ever using the name of God, without ever mentioning God at all. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, but most all of the stories of God's miraculous intervention throughout the scriptures include some person or group of people joining in partnership with God to bring that into action. God almost always acts in cooperation with a person or a group of people. In fact, God hardly appears by name either in the passage from Romans 12 that Lee read for us, Paul's great digression to the believers who live in Rome for how to live in this foreign culture. He wrote, "Love should be shown without pretending. Hate evil and hold on to what is good. Love each other like members of your family. Be the best at showing honor to each other. Don't hesitate to be enthusiastic. Be on fire in the Spirit as you serve the Lord. Be happy in your hope. Stand your ground when you're in trouble, and devote yourselves to prayer. Contribute to the needs of God's people, and welcome strangers into your home. Bless those who harass you. Bless and don't curse them. Be happy with those who are happy and cry with those who cry. Consider everyone as equal and don't think that you're better than anyone else. Instead, associate with people who have no status. Don't think that you're so smart. Don't pay back anyone for their evil actions with evil actions, but show respect for what everyone else believes is good. If possible, to the best of your ability, live at peace with all people. Don't try to get revenge for yourselves, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. It is written, 'Revenge belongs to me, I will repay it back. I will pay it back,' says the Lord. Instead, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. By doing this, you'll pile burning coals of fire upon his head. Don't be defeated by evil, but defeat evil with good." So, how can we best live out being God's people in the midst of foreign culture. Maybe by learning from Esther and Mordecai's behavior in the book of Esther. By remaining faithful to one another. And by remaining faithful to one another, we remain faithful to God. And also by mastering participation in this foreign culture to the extent that it influences others for good. Whether we mention the name of God or not.